Thanks to the choir for that splendid opening. I love those very last words of Darwin's on the origin of species. From so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. I'm not sure if he was thinking of you lot, but it's a wonderful ending to his book. Welcome to the annual Darwin Day lecture. My name is Robert Ashby. I'm chairman of the Board of Trustees of the British Humanist Association. It's my pleasant duty to welcome you all and introduce our chair for the lecture this evening. Today is, of course, the 12th of February. Each year at this time we mark the anniversary of the birth of Charles Darwin by inviting a distinguished scientist to lecture on a key scientific issue or somebody who can make some important comment within the humanist space. It's part of the annual BHA lecture series commemorating great thinkers and writers such as Darwin, Shelley, Voltaire and Bentham. So we do this on the 12th of February, or at least as close as that as we can. Really the only day in the calendar that should really be the glorious 12th, as opposed to the one that we have. This is the BHA's 12th annual Darwin Day lecture. The Darwin lectures are, as I've said, a celebration of science and recognise that science is now even more important to the survival of our planet and humanity. At the BHA, we see science as central to our rationalist proposition, and we do everything we can to promote better appreciation of the scientific method and its benefits, which is where our chair for the lecture this evening comes in, Richard Dawkins, as he has a bit of a thing about science and evolution, as you probably realise, and particularly about how these things are taught and how alternative theories that those of a religious persuasion have dreamt up must be confronted. Not that some of those of religious persuasion might not support humanism, and we've had the interesting situation just recently where even the support of Rowan Williams, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, has publicly agreed that humanism should be included in religious education syllabus for schools. That hasn't necessarily had much impact. Unfortunately, it hasn't necessarily had much impact on the current government, but it is evidence that the BHA continues to punch above our weight in campaigning on a wide range of issues. And one of the things that we've campaigned about from time to time is the teaching of creationism. Richard Dawkins has been reported as saying he would never debate creationists because they've won the moment you agree to have a debate at all. Because what they want is the oxygen of respectability. But he's still created a list of scientific tips for those foolhardy enough to set out to debate with creationists. You may have noticed it was reported yesterday that a member of the Scottish Parliament, John Mason, said that Christianity would unravel if creationism was proved. Well, I'm not sure that that's the case, but he actually believes that creationism is still a widely held belief amongst Britain's religious adherents, although a recent poll showed that actually 75% of people accept human evolution. Richard has been one of the most successful communicators of science to the broader public for 30 years, and he was one of the keynote speakers amongst the many great thinkers and writers and scientists in the lineup that we had at the very successful World Humanist Congress in Oxford in August last year. It was a highlight of what was a very great year for the BHA, and I think 2014 may be seen to be a watershed in the development of humanism in this country. Richard Dawkins is renowned as a British evolutionary biologist and author. His popular science books include The Selfish Gene, The Extended Phenotype, The Blind Watchmaker and The God Delusion. He's a vice president of the British Humanist Association and has been a great supporter of our movement and the BHA for many years. Please welcome our chair for this evening's lecture, Richard Dawkins.
Well, thank you very much. It is true that I don't debate with creationists. I've never actually dared to use the letter of refusal which Robert May, the former president of the Royal Society and chief government advisor says that he uses.
He's Australian, as you may know. When he gets a letter from a creationist inviting him to have a debate, he says, "That would look great on your CV, not so good on mine." Endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. That's not just something that happens to be true, it's something that had to be true, because there's no other way in which endless forms so beautiful and wonderful could possibly have come into existence, other than by slow, gradual, step-by-step progress from very, very simple beginnings. And that's got to be true, I conjecture, not just on this earth, but anywhere in the universe where there's life. That's tantamount to saying that I think that life anywhere in the universe will, if we ever discover it, turn out to be, in some sense, Darwinian life. When Darwin talked of his theory of evolution, I think he meant the word theory in the sense of hypothesis, which is not what we mean by it today. It no longer makes sense to see it that way, although unfortunately the meaning does linger on in the minds of many, including especially our opponents, the opponents that Eugenie Scott has made it her life's work to combat. Some people have suggested calling it a law, but it isn't a law in the sense of Newton's laws or the laws of thermodynamics. There's nothing inexorable that drives evolution in the way that the second law of thermodynamics, say, drives chemistry. Evolution is not a law, it's a fact. It's no longer politic to call it a theory. What it is a fact. It's a fact in the same sense as it's a fact that the Earth orbits the Sun and rotates on its axis 365 times as it does so. Neither of those two facts is immediately apparent to our senses in the way that this lectern is made of wood is apparent to our senses. You have to do a little bit of digging around in order to demonstrate that the Earth is round and that it rotates and goes around the Sun. And in the same way, in evolution, you have to do some digging around, you have to dig for fossils, you have to do some comparative genetic work, comparative anatomy, looking at geographical distribution of species, and so on. But the evidence that Darwin amassed, the evidence that's accrued in 150 years or so since the origin of species, makes it absolutely certain evolution is a fact as fully and conclusively established as the facts of the Keplerian solar system. You can still speak of Darwin's theory of the driving force of evolution, natural selection, perhaps to contrast it with Lamarck's theory, or perhaps to note that while natural selection is probably the only theory to account for adaptive evolution, it's by no means the only theory to account for evolution at the molecular level. The neutral theory probably does indeed account for the majority of evolutionary change at the molecular level, but importantly, not adaptive evolution, evolution in the direction of improvement. In 1859, even the fact of evolution was controversial, which is why Darwin was right to call it a theory in the sense of hypothesis. It was controversial even among scientists. A century and a half on, it is no longer controversial among scientists, but it remains hugely controversial among the general public. And this amounts to an educational disgrace. There's nothing comparable in the way of such a thoroughgoing split between informed and uninformed opinion on a subject of major scientific importance. It's not just an educational disgrace, it's a political calamity when this same educational disgrace infects a substantial proportion of the governing elite of America. And this means that while the scientific elite of America carries on with its work in the lab and in the field, and the United States is beyond question the leading scientific nation of this or any other age, while scientists carry on with their work, there is a cardinal need for a political and a public relations arm of science. Somebody has to man the front line trench so that behind the front line, scientists can continue to do their work and get funding for it. Somebody has to man the trenches so that the schools can get on with the vital work of teaching science, free from sniping by ignorant parents, perverse school boards, and unscrupulous local politicians. Eugenie Scott has spent much of a hard-working lifetime in the frontline trench, and her National Centre for Science Education is her remarkably effective commando unit. She has been the commander who finds time not just to direct her troops, but serve in the ranks alongside them. Her weapons are not those of a belligerent, but of a consummate persuader who uses reason, formidable scientific knowledge, and, well, just plain charm. She's a diplomat, a good lawyer, because contrary to widespread belief, there is such a thing as a good lawyer. I can't really make claim to be a skilled diplomat in the same sense. I once wrote in the New York Times that anybody who doesn't believe in evolution is either ignorant, stupid, or insane. Which, when you think about it, is a simple factual statement. Although, of course, you have to add that ignorance is no crime, and we are all ignorant of most of the things which we might be knowledgeable about. But the great majority of people who don't believe in evolution are simply ignorant of it. They don't know what it's about, and they've been systematically misled. In addition to Jeannie's political skills and her skills as an advocate, there is a pressing need for just sheer hard graft, grunt work, examining legal briefs, putting out daily bulletins and documents, hastening to the scene of local skirmishes in school boards and courtrooms in state after state. The NCSE, her commando unit as I've called it, is a powerhouse of investigative inquiry and information dissemination under her leadership. It's recently broadened its remit to take on climate change deniers as well as education deniers. As an institution, the NCSE is a hero of science, a hero of reason, of enlightenment, of education. And Eugenie Scott, its leader for a quarter of a century until her recent retirement, should be regarded as a hero by all who love science and reason. She's certainly my personal hero, and I'm delighted to ask her to give her lecture on What Would Darwin Say to Today's Creationists? Eugenie Scott.
Thank you very much for that lovely introduction. I have given many Darwin Day talks. This is quite a fun thing to do in the United States for the last 15, 20 years or so. But there is something very, very special about giving a Darwin talk in London, Darwin's town, for part of his life anyway. So thank you so much for inviting me. I very much appreciate this opportunity. Now, there were creationists in Darwin's day, certainly, and they were both similar to and different from today's creationists. So what do I mean by today's creationists? Well, for starters, there's a greater variety of creationists than Darwin is used to. Christians have been in the forefront of objections to evolution then and now, but there is also anti-evolution movement inspired by Islamic creationism. And even Hindu creationism has been the source of an anti-evolution movement, although Hindu creationism is very, very small in comparison with the other two. But in all three cases, anti-evolutionism arises from the literal interpretation of the holy texts of the faith. And in all three cases, there are practitioners of those faiths, whether Christianity, Islam, or Hinduism, who do not interpret the Bible, the Quran, the Gitas as being literally true. And so within each of these religions, there's a considerable range of beliefs about evolution and its veracity. So what would Darwin say to today's creationists? Well, the first thing he'd say is, what deathbed confession? Did Darwin recant evolution on his deathbed? Did he embrace Jesus as his savior? Such is the Darwin legend as recounted by historian Jim Moore. And this is a delightful book if you haven't read it yet. In 1915, Lady Hope presented the deathbed confession story while on a visit to the United States. Elizabeth Reed Cotton was born in Tasmania. She moved to England and married Sir James Hope when he was 69 and she was 35. They were married for only 4 years, and after his death, she remarried evangelist T.A. Denny, who also was considerably older than she was. She kept the name and title Lady Hope, though. What better name for an evangelist, after all? You can totally understand why she would take that point of view. Lady Hope was a temperance crusader, a pamphleteer, an evangelist, the author of several books. By standards of today or then, she was quite an accomplished person. Now, she claimed to have visited and talked to Darwin at Down House in 1881, the year before his death, hence the deathbed confession part of this story. Lady Hope was associated with a London evangelist named James William Condell Fegan. Fegan's causes were temperance, education, and providing homes for orphaned or poor boys in London. He operated several orphanages in the London area, and one in Toronto, actually. The Little Wanderers Home was one of them. It was in southwest London on what is now Greenwich High Road, established in 1879. The grandest of the orphanages was located north of London in Stony Stratford in North Buckinghamshire, where, think Dickens, smoggy, dirty England. Doubtless this was a much healthier kind of environment for the boys to grow up in. This school lasted until the 1960s, interestingly enough. Now, presently, the building has been divided up into many offices, and some of you might be interested to know that the chapel now houses an Indian restaurant. Amazing things you learn on the internet, isn't it? The lineal descendant of the Fegan orphanages is a child-centered social work organization, Fegan.org, which is still operating today. Now, Fegan's goal was to get these kids, these poor boys, these orphan boys, these tribes of little hooligans running around, like I say, think Dickens, running around the streets of London, get them out of this environment where they were likely to become pickpockets or thieves and not get enough to eat and were living in a smoggy, unhealthy environment. You know, he's got something there, I think. But his plan was to take these kids and ship them off to Canada and send them to homes in Canada out in the prairie provinces where they would become farm laborers. Home children, they were called. And speaking of the internet, there's a fascinating series of websites and a lot of genealogical organizations trying to track down relatives and ancestors who were some of these home children. Fascinating stories associated with these young people. Taking these London street boys out of their environment and plopping them in Calgary wasn't a really successful operation, although they probably got better food, and some of them really did get better homes than the ones that they were in, but it's a very complicated situation. But back to our story. Fegan's parents lived in Down. And very likely, Down's a very small town, as you know, very likely knew the Darwins. In any regard, there's plenty of evidence that Fegan knew Darwin. In the summer of 1880, as a young man in his late 20s, Fegan had taken a group of boys camping in Kent, and he swung by Down House. And the boys assembled outside of Down House and sang a couple of hymns for Charles. And Charles thought this was really great, gave each of the boys 6 pence. The boys thought that was great. They really hip hip hooray for Darwin. They thought that was pretty great. Subsequently, Fegan wrote Darwin asking if he could have permission to use the reading room in Down to conduct evangelical services. And he wrote to Darwin because Darwin actually had rented this house. It's a very small room. If you've ever been to Down, you can see it. It's still there. And Darwin had rented this from the building's owner with the intent of making a school out of it. But it really wasn't used very often. Kids, you know, the Darwins educated they were homeschoolers. The Darwin were kind of hippies for their time. They really had rather unusual ideas about child rearing for the time, like keeping your children with you instead of shipping them off to boarding school. At any rate, if you go to the Darwin Correspondence Project, you can see a letter from Darwin to Fegan that was written sometime between December 1880 and February of 1881, where Darwin gives him permission to use the reading room. It's a letter from Darwin. The tone is very cordial, it's very polite, it's very generous. That's the way Darwin was, of course. And in the letter, Darwin even praises Fegan for his efficacy in preaching, which has, according to the letter, saved the town drunk, at least one of the town drunks. There's also a reference to Fegan in Emma Darwin's correspondence to her daughter in February of 1881, around the same time, referring to presumably the same person. She wrote, "Hurrah for Mr. Fegan. Old M was a notable old drunkard in the village of Down, converted through Mr. Fegan in 1881. So clearly, Darwin was acquainted with Fegan. Now, James Moore thinks that when Fegan became ill in the summer of 1881, Lady Hope replaced him in his evangelical duties out in the country. She was of the same social class as Darwin. She certainly could feel appropriate calling on him. She would probably have been invited in for a cup of tea. In her recounting of the Darwin legend, she mentions aspects of the inside of Darwin's house. So it's quite probable that she actually did have a meeting with Darwin. This was in the summer of 1881. Darwin was definitely slowing down, but he was certainly not on his deathbed. He died, as you know, in 1882. Now, there may indeed have been a meeting with Lady Hope, but there's absolutely no evidence anywhere that there was any kind of refutation by Darwin of his views late in life. So how did the story of the deathbed confession get started? The first major telling of the Darwin legend was in August of 1915 when Hope was in the United States, taking part in a Baptist evangelical revival. There were many other guest speakers. She would have been in her early 70s. So this was about 25 years after the alleged tea with Darwin when he supposedly confessed to be rejecting evolution. The main speaker was an A.T. Robinson from the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. Trivial fact for those of you who like intelligent design trivia. The Southern Baptist Theological Seminary was the place where intelligent design proponent William Dembski hung his hat for several years as a professor there. He left in 2006 because he was too theologically liberal. Lady Hope told Robertson that Darwin had confessed his love of Scripture on his deathbed and that in his youth he had said things that he no longer agreed with. There was a version of this conversation published in a Baptist publication, the Watchman Examiner. She quoted Darwin as saying, "I was a young man with unformed ideas. I threw out queries, suggestions, wondering all the time over everything, and to my astonishment, the ideas took like wildfire. People made a religion out of them." The story spread very widely. It was embellished both by Lady Hope as well as by followers of hers. Different versions had Darwin renouncing evolution, speaking of his love of Christ, and so forth and so on. Now, the Darwin children indignantly denied any deathbed confession and denied any visit by Lady Hope. But of course, this was 1915. The kids were all grown. Emma had died long before. Probably, and the children would have been little kids when this alleged visit took place, so it's not really probable that they would have remembered her anyway. There's also a difference between Lady Hope actually having visited Down House and a deathbed confession. One can be true without the other being true. Well, given that possibility, was Lady Hope lying? Not necessarily so. In fact, probably not. We know a lot more about false memories these days, and how easily memories become conflated, and how easy it is to believe what you want to believe. The United States television anchor Brian Williams is going through an experience right now that very likely involves conflated memories. And, any of us who have looked at the skeptics' literature on false memory can be sympathetic. 25 years after the alleged event, it's probable that Hope's memories were embellished and misremembered, and that she remembered what she wanted to remember. In any regard, there's no evidence from the rest of her life that she was deliberately deceitful. Suffice to say, though, that Darwin did not renounce evolution. It is also very unlikely he became a Christian on his deathbed. His personal views on Jesus or Christianity were set out pretty clearly in his autobiography. He felt that Christianity's doctrine of damnation for anyone who is not Christian was, as he put it, a damnable doctrine, because, of course, that would mean both his freethinker father and his freethinker grandfather would be ruled out from salvation. Rejecting Christianity isn't the same thing as becoming an atheist either. There's speculation, which Darwin scholars certainly will debate, about whether the death of his daughter Annie at the age of 10 was a turning point for Darwin's religious beliefs. There's also evidence that even before Annie's death, he had doubts about the existence of God and the theodicy issue, the issue in Christian theology about the problem of evil. How is it that a good and just God could allow suffering and pain and misery in the world? Why would a loving God let an innocent child like Annie die a painful death? Perhaps either there was not a God, or that there was a God but a cruel one who is not worth worshiping. He might well have been influenced in these views by his friend Thomas Henry Huxley, who was the inventor of the term and concept of agnosticism. Huxley believed that, quote, "in this world, one can never know," which was pretty much the belief held by Darwin, who wrote to his friend and fellow scientist, the American minister Asa Gray, that when it came to contemplating the nature of God, quote, "I feel most deeply that the whole subject is too profound for the human intellect. A dog might as well speculate on the mind of Newton. Let each man hope and believe what he can. Certainly I agree with you that my views are not at all necessarily atheistical." You might be interested that Darwin's deathbed confession is even criticized by young Earth creationist organizations such as Answers in Genesis. It's listed on their website as arguments to avoid, but it is still regularly encountered. Evolution can take place. Well, what else would Darwin say to today's creationists? He would be very surprised at the reemergence of the idea that Earth is only a few thousand years old. Remember that Darwin attended Edinburgh, the University of Edinburgh, where he became very engrossed in geology. And in fact, many people are not aware that his first several monographs and his first several books were all on geology. He was first a geologist and then turned his insights to biology. He knew quite well that geologists since the 1700s had been studying the effects of wind and water and mapping strata across wide geographical areas to show that there were understandable patterns in the rocks and that the surface of the planet had a history. And those data led to the conclusion that the Earth was ancient. In the early 1800s, Darwin's Cambridge professor Charles Lyell contributed the principle of uniformitarianism, which reinforced the idea that erosion and other processes we observe today also shaped the world in the past. An ancient, changing Earth clearly contradicted the Christian doctrine of special creationism. And it also contradicted the date dutifully published in the margins of Bibles, even in the 1850s, that creation occurred in 4004 BC. So the idea that Earth was young would have seemed very strange to Darwin. That was not the position of the church at the time, and certainly was not the position of science. Yet young Earthism is a key part of modern young Earth creationism, as is catastrophic geology as an explanation for all sedimentary features on the planet. And it's very easy to understand why. If mountains and structures like Grand Canyon are the product of rapid deposition and rapid erosion, then the Earth is young. And if the Earth is young, there's no time for these uniformitarian processes to take place, and therefore there's no time for evolution. So the young Earth creationists have an internally very consistent position. Show that the Earth is not ancient, show that the Earth is young, and evolution withers, which is why they spend so much time talking about supposed evidence for a young Earth or against an old Earth. Creationists have to come up with alternate explanations for geological features such as Grand Canyon and the Colorado Plateau, which overlies it. The short explanation: it's laid down by Noah's flood. The approximately 4,000 feet of Grand Canyon is laid down in the early flood. That's Grand Canyon in the far right-hand part of this diagram. And the other approximately 15,000 feet of strata of the rest of the Colorado Plateau is laid down over a few more months. The whole deposition portion of the flood takes about 250 days. Then another approximately 100 days for drainage, we haven't even gotten to cutting Grand Canyon yet. Grand Canyon is cut catastrophically over a period of days or weeks by the release of a large impoundment of water that's located north of Grand Canyon, carves the canyon catastrophically, and then flows off to the Gulf of Mexico in days or weeks. If you want to know more about why Grand Canyon really wasn't deposited catastrophically or cut catastrophically, this is the commercial, you might consider going on the National Center for Science Education's raft trip down Grand Canyon, which is a whole lot of fun. We talk about the creationist explanation of Grand Canyon. We talk a whole lot about real geology, and you can make up your own mind. In this picture, this is a really fun stop on the canyon trip, by the way. This is a big slab of Coconino sandstone that fell down from a layer way, way up near the top of Grand Canyon. And it's tumbled all the way down. You can see the river in the background, so it's really easy to get to. Geologists are quite united in the idea that the Coconino sandstone is a wind lane, an aeolian deposit. Creationists have a little problem here, because you've got lots and lots of layers of things like limestone and sandstone and mudstone, things that are obviously lain down by water. Water, 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 water. And then you have this big, thick layer of aeolian deposits covered by water, 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 water. How does that work? How do you get the floodwaters to stop for a while the wind blows in this incredible amount of sand? And then it sits there very obediently while you cover it up with more floodwater. This is kind of a hard thing to argue geologically. One characteristic of fluid lane strata, whether it's water lane or wind lane, is crossbedding, which you see in this picture. Sediment forms layers on the lee side of the dune. Now, geologists have ways of discriminating between water lane crossbeds and wind lane crossbeds, having to do with the grain size, the distribution, the grain shape, other features, microscopic features of the rock. And for decades, it's been the conclusion of geologists that the Coconino sandstone is in fact aeolian. It is laid down by air. One of the really interesting things about creation science is that these guys actually get out there and they do science-ish. In 2010, a poster was presented at the Geological Society of America's meeting by students from a small Ohio Christian liberal arts school called Cedarville College, reporting their research conducted on grains of sands from the Coconino sandstone. Students took thin sections of the structure and then they examined the grains of sand for size, shape, sorting, and so forth and so on. And they concluded that the sand might have been deposited in water. Now, needless to say, at the GSA, although in creationist publications, you know where the water comes from? It's the big water. The water, of course, is Noah's flood, although that's not mentioned at GSA. Now, the student work, to my knowledge, has not been replicated, and in any event, it focuses on a tiny little amount of data, ignoring the huge amount of data that confirms aeolian deposition. And perhaps it's needless to say, geologists have not been convinced by this research that the Coconino is water-lean. Now, something Darwin would be rather dismayed to hear is that creationists have regularly accused him of plagiarism. The main accusation is that Darwin supposedly stole the idea of evolution by natural selection from Alfred Russel Wallace. You all know the story. Darwin received a letter from Wallace that sort of laid out the basics of natural selection, and Darwin, of course, had been working on his big idea for decades, and he got his act together and within a year published the book for which he is best known, On the Origin of Species. An excerpt from from Wallace's letter to Darwin and an abstract of his idea that Darwin had written in the 1830s were read together at the Linnean Society and published together in the Journal of the Linnean Society that summer. Russell was thrilled. His work was being held up as comparable to that of a man he admired hugely, a man that scientists admired hugely across the board. By that time, Darwin was really developing a good scientific reputation. Wallace was nothing but grateful all his life for the attention that Darwin paid him. There's nothing in Darwin's correspondence, nothing in Wallace's correspondence that would suggest that Wallace felt that he had been unfairly treated or that Darwin had plagiarized in any sense from his work. A second candidate for the accusation that Darwin was a plagiarist was that he stole the work of Edward Blyth. Now, Blyth was curator of the Royal Asiatic Society of the Bengal Museum in India. Mostly an ornithologist, but a general all-purpose naturalist. He had correspondence with Darwin. It's all in the Darwin Correspondence Project. You can read all about it. And Darwin thought very highly of Blyth's work. In the 1830s, he wrote some articles on the effects of artificial selection and suggested perhaps an equivalent natural process. This is sounding familiar, isn't it? On the other hand, Blyth rejected transmutation, as they called the change from one species to another. The word evolution, the word evolve, was very rarely used in Darwin's day. Transmutation was the much more common term. So he wasn't really dealing in an evolutionary context. In 1959, Loren Eiseley claimed that Blyth's work had not only preceded Darwin, but that Darwin had cribbed the idea and cribbed examples from Blyth. Most scholars, however, dealing with more recent materials than 1959 that Eiseley had to work with. Again, this wonderful trove of correspondence and other material that's become available just in the last 15 or 20 years, that when Darwin formulated his ideas, when he had correspondence with Blyth, correspondence back and forth with Blyth and Darwin, and none of the Darwin scholars believe that there's any truth to Eiseley's claim. And like Wallace, Blyth continued to correspond with Darwin, never indicated he felt his work had been stolen. Patrick Matthew was a Scots farmer. He wrote a book called Naval Timber on forestry, in other words, how to raise trees to provide timber for the British Navy. This was a very well-accepted idea, a well-accepted book. He set out the basic idea of natural selection in an afterword, but basically nobody paid any attention to it. This was decades before Darwin published The Origin of Species. Now, when The Origin of Species was published, Matthew wrote a letter to Gardner's Chronicle noting his priority, and Darwin, ever the gentleman, wrote back, quote, "I freely acknowledge that Mr. Matthew has anticipated by many years the explanation which I have offered on the origin of species under the name of natural selection." So did Darwin plagiarize from Matthew? Should we give Matthew the credit for developing the theory of natural selection? Historian Peter Bowler perhaps said it best, quote, "Simple priority is not enough to earn a thinker a place in the history of science. One has to develop the idea and convince others of its value to make a real contribution. Darwin's notebooks confirm that he drew no inspiration from Matthew or any of the other alleged precursors. Such efforts to denigrate Darwin misunderstand the whole point of the history of science. Matthew did suggest a basic idea of selection, but he did nothing to develop it, and he published it in the appendix to a book on the raising of trees for shipbuilding. No one took him seriously, and he played no role in the emergence of Darwinism." So, what else would Darwin say about today's creationism? Well, one type of creationism that he would be very surprised at is Islamic creationism. Now, from the Crusades on through Austrian and Holy Roman Empire encounters with Ottoman Turks, Europeans were aware of Islam, though the religion and the people who practiced it were rarely encountered. Turkey was perhaps the most familiar and was often portrayed in literature and music as the exotic East. Probably many of you have seen the really quite wonderful movie Amadeus about Mozart. Do you remember that great scene where he runs in and he might even be carrying a turban? "I'm writing an abduction from the Seraglio." Everything is Turkish these days. I mean, the late 1700s, there would be fads in which the exotic East was something that was held up as a cultural item. Darwin's children even sketched Turks on the backs of old drafts On the Origin of Species. This just showed up in a day or so as an exhibit that I think is at the Smithsonian. I thought, okay, great, Turks, here you go. Darwin would have been very surprised at the number of immigrants to Europe and Great Britain from Islamic states that we see today. You just did not encounter large numbers of people who were practicing the religion of Mohammed. Anti-evolutionism in the Islamic world is all over the map, as shown by these Pew data from the Pew Foundation, is an American foundation that does very good survey research from 2013. They studied countries all over the world, and the data that I'm presenting here are just from the people within the various countries who indicated that they were of the Islamic faith. Now, I've done just enough survey research to appreciate how hard it is. And I also work with people who have tried to do survey research across language barriers. And anytime you're asking about scientific issues and you're having to translate scientific phrases, it's really hard to do right. I would suggest to you, whenever you see data showing acceptance or rejection of evolution in non-English speaking countries, take it with a bit of a grain of salt, wait for replication, because numbers are likely to vary. It's hard enough to do it. Asking the proper question, the proper order, survey research is very difficult. But these are suggestive. You can see the range of variation from Kazakhstan, 79% believing humans and other living things have evolved over time, and Iraq, 27%. That's quite a range. Remember that Islam, there's no pope. There's no equivalent of the Mormon president. There's no top-down theology. Islam is very much bottom-up. There is nobody who directs what Islamic theology is. An imam might decide that the Quran should be interpreted this way, another imam would interpret it that way, and the people surrounding those two imams would follow those prescriptions, and they may be diametrically opposed to each other. So even within the same country, you will find very different views about evolution, and certainly there are different strains of Islam in different countries, and this is, I think, reflected in the variety. Evolution is taught regularly as part of the Iranian curriculum, for example. So it's a very fluid situation to consider evolution in Islamic countries. Note that in this survey, Turkey has quite a low acceptance of evolution, and this may reflect a very strong anti-evolution movement in that country. Writings of the Turkish creationist Adnan Aktar are very widespread in the Muslim community, translated into many different languages. There's a whole team of writers at his organization, BAV, which I will not try to pronounce in Turkish, who write under the pen name Harun Yahya. BAV publishes hundreds of books, several languages, has an extensive website, and Akhtar has a television program that reportedly has a very large viewership. Now, during the 1980s and 1990s, American young earth creationists visited Turkey and to spread their gospel of anti-evolutionism. Akhtar seems to have taken a lot of his creationism from the young earth creationists, except for the young earth part. He sort of jettisons the idea of flood geology and that the earth is young. He doesn't really care about that. But he does focus very, very closely, as do the young earth creationists, on the weaknesses of evolution and the obviousness of everything having been purposefully designed. But to the Turkish anti-evolutionists, evolution, or Darwinism as they call it, is not just an idea about where the diversity of life came from. It's not just a scientific idea. It's a vicious anti-God ideology that has inspired most of the despots of history. Much of Akhtar's anti-evolutionism is also tied in with anti-Western political ideology and Turkish nationalism. It's part of the political struggle that's going on in Turkey between those who want to keep Turkey secular, as it was after the fall of the Ottomans, and those who want to have a more Iran-like Islamic state. And creationism, anti-Western ideology are brought in service of this particular movement. Famously, he has published the Atlas of Creationism. This is a university environment. Probably many of you are associated with the university. How many people have seen this book before? Are any of it? Yes, there's a smattering of hands. This is a beautiful book. There's actually 3 of them so far, and they're all very similar. It's about this big. It's this huge coffee table book. It's got a velvet color. The pictures are fabulously beautiful. No expense was paid in this book. It's highly illustrated. The photography is beautiful, most of it cribbed from National Geographic and other people who are really good at taking pictures. You kind of get the feeling that maybe copyright laws are rather laxly applied in Turkey. But the basic of the Atlas of Creation is to show, here's a modern form, here's the fossil form, oh look, they're just alike, therefore evolution hasn't taken place. This is a caddisfly as an example. Here we have a modern caddisfly. It looks just like the fossil caddisflies, therefore evolution hasn't taken place. You want to look a little bit more closely at that fly. His living caddisfly happens to be a photo of a fishing lure from there's a site on the internet where this guy hand ties fishing lures, and he's really good at it. These are beautiful lures. But it's not quite the same thing as having a real caddisfly. I mean, this gives you a little bit of a measure of the accuracy of the Atlas of Creation. And the Atlas of Creation is not famous for its scientific accuracy. So Darwin would be very surprised at the extent of Islamic creationism, which has influenced the creationist movement in Great Britain and on the continent, much more than in the United States. Now, throughout his life, Darwin was concerned for his legacy. He worked hard. He wanted to be recognized for his contributions to science. Well, of course, he was recognized by his peers. He's buried in Westminster Abbey, of course. But I think he would have been very pleased overall to see the reception of his work in the 20th and 21st centuries. Considering how hard he worked on the origin of species, he'd be quite pleased at the large percentage of the general public who recognize him as the author. Alas, 7% think he wrote The Naked Ape. And there's a bit of confusion with more modern scientists, including the author of The God Delusion and The Selfish Gene. But really, that's a large percent of people who recognize him as the author of The Origin of Species, and really only 1% think he wrote The Naked Chef. In 2009, which you remember is the big Darwin anniversary year, the Faraday Institute for Science and Religion conducted an international poll of attitudes about evolution. In the UK, 65% of the population accepted evolution, 28% with theistic overtones, plus 37% with no need for God. From the United States perspective, my friends, this is astonishing numbers. Our incidence of the acceptance of evolution in the United States hovers in the high 40s on a good day, going downhill with the wind at our back. So we would be more than happy with this number. Again, how you ask the question makes all the difference in the world. And if you want to know more about polling of evolution, go to NCSE's website, because we've got quite a lot of discussion on it, and it's very interesting. Yet, even with the high rate of acceptance of evolution in the United Kingdom, there are problems with the teaching of evolution. As members of the BHA well know, corrective measures needed to be taken to ensure that creationism wouldn't be taught in British schools. Now, I'm not going to come here and tell you about creationism in British schools because I'm not an expert on that. My impression from talking with British teachers and with professors who train British teachers, and this is only an impressionistic account, I don't have data, so take it for what it's worth. It's been my impression that there's a high degree of acceptance of evolution among British teachers, just like in the British general population. Darwin's your guy, evolution's okay with you. But there's quite a slip twixt cup and lip, as it were. Teachers accept evolution, they don't necessarily teach it. Some teachers have reported that they don't feel that they know enough about evolution, that they're not well grounded enough in the science to feel comfortable teaching it. And so if a student pushes back, if a student brings in a pamphlet, gee, I have this pamphlet showing that radiocarbon dating is invalid, therefore the Earth is young, they don't really know how to answer that question. So like American teachers, they just kind of tend to skip evolution that semester. The other thing to think about, and this is a characteristic of teachers in general, that's why we love them, teaching is a helping profession. You don't go into school teaching if you want to fight with people. You can become a lawyer if you want to fight with people. My husband's a lawyer. Why are we making lawyer jokes? But seriously, teachers want to be nurturing of students. If a student is reluctant to learn evolution, teachers often, both in my country and I hear in yours, I have no data, they are reluctant to push it because they feel they might be producing uncomfortable experiences for students. And teachers are very concerned about that. They want the students to thrive, they want the students to learn, but they don't want to hurt them, so to speak. There are various things that can be done about this. I'm constantly hectoring my fellow scientists in the United States, those who teach at universities and colleges, to do a better job teaching evolution. Don't assume that your students are going to just get it through osmosis. You have to be explicit about the importance of evolution to understanding biology and geology. If a high school teacher doesn't know enough evolution to feel comfortable teaching it, and to feel comfortable teaching it in a way that really communicates to students that common ancestry is the glue that holds biology together, just like the periodic table is the glue that holds chemistry together. If a teacher doesn't feel that she understands enough of the basic science to do that well and comfortably, that's not the fault of the education school. That's the fault of the science faculty. So consider yourself gently and diplomatically chastised. But if we could bring Darwin back, imagine how excited he would be at the discoveries that have been made since he died in 1882. As a geologist, he would be very excited about continental drift, because continental drift solves so many biogeographic problems. biogeography, the science of the distribution of plants and animals. This is an extremely underappreciated piece of the Darwinian worldview, if you will. Darwin spent a lot of time in Origin of Species and other publications of his, really hammering away at how the distribution of plants and animals on the earth makes sense only in the context that common ancestry had occurred. And it still is probably, I think it's probably the best explanation or evidence, if you will, for evolution, understandable by lay people. You don't need statistics, you don't need biochemistry, you just, here's a warthog. I mean, it's great, it's wonderful. Continental drift solves, as I say, so many biogeographic puzzles. Marsupials, everybody's favorite little creature. Marsupials have this really strange distribution. You find them in South America, in Australia, and part of North America. There are marsupial fossils in Antarctica as well. So that little blue stretch around the bottom should actually be orange as well. Well, continental drift makes sense of the distribution of marsupials. South America, Antarctica, and Australia were connected in a supercontinent called Gondwana. Gondwana broke apart, continents moved to their present location over millions of years. Well, that explains South America and Australia, but where did the North American, how did we get possums in North America? Well, continental drift to the rescue again. There's Gondwana in the upper right-hand diagram. Note that South America and North America were separated for most of their history and were connected only when water levels lowered enough for a land bridge to form between them. That's how possums got into North America, and the eutherian or placental mammals like llamas and camels and deer and lions and tigers and bears, well, not really, mountain lions anyway, how those animals got into South America and actually replaced a lot of the placentals. So the peculiar distribution of marsupials around the planet is very tidily explained by continental drift, and so are many other puzzles. I would have loved to have talked about monkeys in South America and monkeys in Africa, because I'm a physical anthropologist, and that's really this great study that, or great bunches of theories that have to do with island hopping and all kinds of fun stuff like that. But there's only so much time, so you'll have to just be content with fossils as my biogeographic example. But just imagine how excited Darwin would have been at how much we've learned about biogeography since his demise. He would be delighted with Mendelian genetics. Remember that Darwin never really had a very clear idea at all about how stuff gets passed on from generation to generation. We all know it happens, but the mechanism of heredity was something that was simply not really understood when Darwin was writing on the Origin of Species, and really for the latter part of the 1800s. And if you remember in the aftermath of the publication of On the Origin of Species, Darwin made these two big points: that common ancestry had occurred and that natural selection was the major engine driving evolution. Common ancestry was accepted pretty quickly. Natural selection, less so. It took a long time for natural selection to really take its place as the powerful evolutionary mechanism it is, because Darwin didn't know, and nobody else did either, didn't know anything about heredity. There were these ideas about blending heredity, but the problem is that if you've got a population of organisms and it's under natural selection, you're going to reduce the variability in that population the next generation. And if it's still under natural selection, you're going to reduce that variability a little bit more, and what happens? Pretty soon you don't have anything. How do we generate variability every generation so that natural selection has something to work on? And this is where Mendelian particulate genetics came in and just saved natural selection's bacon, so to speak, because it provided that missing evidence that Darwin didn't know anything about. I think if Darwin understood what we understand about basic Mendelian genetics, he would just be so excited and so delighted, especially to see how it so strongly influenced the acceptance of natural selection. and the more recent discoveries of Watson and Crick on the molecular basis of genetics, he would find a very exciting supplement to comparative anatomy, comparative embryology, that he'd had to depend upon to show the evolutionary relationships among animals and plants. Now with molecular genetics, we have a whole new way of showing those evolutionary relationships. It has expanded our understanding of evolutionary biology in ways that Darwin would never have dreamed of, but which he would have delighted in. Darwin could see that embryologically, the more recently two forms share a common ancestor, the more similar they were. If you look at the mammals on the right-hand side of this chart, they all look more like each other at any given time in their embryological development than they look like turtles or birds. Mammals are more closely related to one another than they are to turtles or birds because mammals all shared a common ancestor with each other more recently than they shared a common ancestor with the varmints on the other side of that chart. Darwin understood this, but having the tools of molecular genetics, which evolutionary biologists have now, just opens this whole new window on understanding the process of development and its relationship to evolution. The field of, which informally called evo-devo, evolution and development, looking at particularly the early acting genes that lay down basic body plans of organisms. Which is the front end of the organism, which is the back end of the organism, which is the right side, well, not right side, which is the top and the bottom, which is the, are you going to have segments? If you have segments, are you going to pop an appendage out? Is it going to be an antenna? Is it going to be a leg? Is it going to be a wing? We understand much more about the genes of constructing different body plans and using that kind of information, which has been developed over the last 20 years, really. Very, very fascinating and brilliant experiments done to try to tease out those relationships. We're able to show relationships among very distant groups of organisms. And actually, one of the most fascinating aspects of this evo-devo field, to me, as an outsider, is showing that many of these early acting genes are really the same in creatures as different as fruit flies and mice, as insects and mammals, which have not shared an ancestor for millions and millions, hundreds of millions of years. Imagine how excited Darwin would be to find these kinds of data to help reconstruct the tree of life and help explain some of the real puzzles in life. Now, why does one major branch of organisms have the nervous system on the belly, so to speak, and another major branch of life have the nervous system on the back? Well, some of these early acting genes are a way of understanding those kind of basic body plan differences. You kind of wish you could bring the old boy back just to say, see, look, this is really neat. We can demonstrate common ancestry and trace the various branches of the tree of life using ways and means that Darwin never dreamed of. But even some of the means that Darwin did know about, like the fossil record, have also changed considerably. Darwin had speculated in the first edition of On the Origin of Species on the evolution of whales, something like a bear, he wrote, which took to the water, gradually developed the specialized locomotor and echolocation and other specialized characteristics of whales. It really wasn't a very good explanation. And Darwin was widely mocked by his contemporaries for it. And the second edition doesn't have something like a whale at all. It was just sort of quietly taken off the record there. Now, Darwin knew, everybody else knew, scientific community knew at the time that whales had to be related to mammals. There are just too many characteristics of whales for them not to be mammals. They might be shaped like many marine creatures, but all the other plumbing indicates that they are mammals and related. I mean, they're related to land mammals, so what's going on? But there was no fossil record in Darwin's day. Now, there is an abundance. There are lots and lots and lots of whale fossils. We know a great deal more about the basic outline of what evolved when in the appearance of the major group of mammals to which, the cetaceans, to which whales belong. Imagine how delighted Darwin would be. It wasn't like a bear. And just imagine how delighted he would be with our more recent understanding of human evolution. In Darwin's day, there were a couple of these mysterious fossils called Neanderthals, but no real human fossil record at all. No good understanding of human evolution. At the end of On the Origin of Species, Darwin wrote, "Light will be shed on the origin of man and his history." Kind of ducking it a little bit there. Well, light certainly was shed and will be shed. Things have improved. You know, one of the things, if you ever want to see physical anthropologists start twitching, quote the creationist claim that you can put all human fossils on a couple of library tables. It just drives us nuts. You can't even put all the Homo erectus fossils on a couple of library tables. We really have lots and lots and lots of human fossils. Nobody knows anything about Homo erectus, right? To most people, this is a really obscure period in human evolution. It's a really interesting one. But Homo erectus, who's that? I know about Australopithecines, I know about Neanderthals. No, there's this whole branch of human evolution most people haven't heard anything about at all, and there's a whole bunch of fossils. There are more Homo erectus fossils than there are Tyrannosaurus fossils. The human fossil record is not characterized by paucity. Now, sometimes, a Tyrannosaurus fossil is a lot bigger, okay? Human fossils are a little teeny. But we have lots of fossils. We have a very good idea of the basic outline of human evolution. Now, my colleagues in physical anthropology get all excited about my Anthropus is older than your Anthropus, and there's a tremendous amount of splitting and a tremendous amount of angels dancing on the head of pins, but the basic outlines everybody agrees with. We stood up before we got big brains. We got tools before we got big brains. We had to stand up, get tools and big brains before we got things like art and expressive culture. That is all you need to know in terms of human evolution. And you'll let the physical anthropologist bicker about the precise relationship between fossil ABC and fossils XYZ. The big ideas we all agree upon with remarkable agreement. So in conclusion, what would Darwin say to today's creationists? Well, I suspect that he would give them his sternest gaze and ask, haven't you been paying attention during the last 153 years? And I thank you kindly for paying attention to me for the last 45 minutes or so.
Brilliant talk, Dr. Scott. Thank you very much indeed. That was absolutely fascinating. I've got a quick question. Incidentally, I was in Manchester City Centre the other day, and I asked a Jehovah's Witness about marsupials. And she told me that they fled their predators to Australia. So that's your answer on that one. But I just wondered if you could tell me, because you debate with creationists, and I've seen a lot of this stuff on YouTube, and I think it's fantastic. Have there been any examples when you've been speaking to a hall like this with some of those people who are completely blinded by faith, that there's been a kind of reverse journey from Damascus? Have you ever had anyone come up to you afterwards and say, do you know what? Some of that stuff sounds quite interesting. Has that ever have you ever gone hallelujah on the way home? Gaul and the public is divided into three parts.
There are people who have no problem with evolution, probably most of the people in this room. There are people who really don't know very much about evolution, and there are people who strongly reject evolution. I tend to talk to the ones in the middle because I want to educate people about evolution. The people who are strongly opposed to evolution being taught to their children, they reject the idea that it's true. Those tend to be people who, because of their religious ideology, reject. They see that they believe it's incompatible, that common ancestry evolution could have occurred, and the Bible be literally true. And they are correct. The Bible cannot be literally true and evolution having occurred. They got that part right. I'm a humanist. I'm delighted here to be a guest of my fellow humanists across the pond. I'm a humanist, so I'm not going to have the credibility to talk to somebody from that religious tradition. But I know many evangelical Christians who accept evolution, and they are the ones who have to talk to their fellow religious believers to try to show them how they accept science, but still retain what they consider the important elements of their faith. I'm not a person of faith. As the old saying goes, I don't have a dog in that fight. They can argue it out. Okay? But I think it's important that people understand evolution and understand its importance as a basic science literacy kind of issue. And I think it's also just empirically true that many people of faith have and note the direction here, have accommodated their faith to the science. When you are accommodating your science to the faith, that's when we have to talk. But I've got no complaints about the arrow going in the other direction.
We once had a creationist student at Oxford, and he came from an American college, a fundamentalist college, and he attended my course of lectures. And at the end of the last lecture, he came down to the front, slammed his fist on the bench, and said, "Gee, this evolution, it really makes sense." Another question. Yes.
I'm wondering...
Wait for the mic.
Hi there. I'm wondering that you said that with evolution that some faiths, they have bottom-up thinking in terms of how they accept new ideas, such as Islam. So I'm wondering, do you think then that this suggests that in some ways evolution is not compatible with some faiths? And if so, do you think that as long as some evolutions will stay in people continue believing in them, there will not be a belief in faith in those regions?
Well, it's up to religion to accommodate to science, quite honestly. We do not bend science to fit political ideology, religious ideology, economic ideology. We don't bend science to fit an ism, okay? Science has to be what it is. Evolution, the idea that living things descended with modification from common ancestors, is incompatible with many religious views. That's the way it is. It is not incompatible, sorry, too many negatives here. It is not incompatible with many other religious views. But as I say, I'm a humanist, I'm not a person of faith. I let the theologians and ministers argue among themselves. What I do is encourage people of faith who like science, who appreciate the importance of evolution, to speak up. Sometimes these people feel like maybe they shouldn't because they might be making their friends and neighbors and fellow congregationists uncomfortable. I've known others who were very active in their churches, who teach adult Sunday schools, classes where they talk about science and evolution and their particular faith tradition. This is an evolutionary system, okay? I'm an anthropologist, so I tend to look at religion as being a cultural universal. Every human culture that has ever been described has some belief in a non-material universe. Richard talked about the material universe that we are most familiar with, and that's the universe that science deals with. But just about all of us, all of our fellow human beings, all the cultures have come up with some sort of concept of something other than this. Lots of literature on why this might be so. The fact that it is universally believed does not make it universally true. That's not my particular belief, but the fact of the matter is, religion has a number of very adaptive qualities. Otherwise, you wouldn't find it across the board in human cultures. Richard and I will have very friendly discussions over beer about that. But it is a cultural universal. There are lots of ways that you can see that, us, them, there's all kinds of ways in which religion can be adaptive. That doesn't mean it's good, that doesn't mean it's bad, but it does mean that it's selected for, and it's going to be around. So if you believe that just by teaching people science, people are going to stop believing in the supernatural, I got a bridge to sell you. I think that is not a point of view that is that we've had any experience with working.
Jeannie, I should have said you're an anthropologist. When I said you're a lawyer, I didn't mean you're a lawyer. No. I meant that you have the capacity and the ability to deal with legal problems, which you have to do in your job. I didn't mean to insult you.
No, I didn't. You might have insulted my husband and my daughter, both of whom are lawyers, but everybody's used to lawyers.
Next question. Is there one in the middle block? Yes, one here.
So Charles Darwin was a great man, extra man. Even if you disagree with him, you can't doubt that. But do you reckon that learning about his theory of, or fact even, should I say, of evolution damages the significance in discussing about religious teachings or even philosophical theories?
Well, like I said, evolution is incompatible with certain religious beliefs. And that sets up a conflict which has to be resolved either by rejecting the science, which we would consider unfortunate, or by modifying the religious beliefs so that science can rest comfortably within them. Is that what you were talking about, or did I understand you properly?
Just trying to stick out like significance in, I mean, is it even important to discuss religion in that sense? If evolution is fact, does it hold any significance at all?
Well, religion, if I understand you correctly, your question may be because evolution is real. It did happen. It is factually supported, etc. Therefore, religion is done away with. Is that more or less the, okay, no.
I think we've had enough on religion. Let's move
because there's so many varieties of religion.
Is there anybody near the back who's got a question? No? Okay, there's one there. Okay.
Hi, yes. I was just interested in whether you thought genetic engineering is a problem for creationists or helped them, because if we can think in, 100 years' time that mankind, who might have evolved, can create without natural selection a new beast, does that not help creationists in making the point that some other being billions of years ago has got plenty of time to have got to where we've got to, and therefore could have created anything they like?
Well, in general, most of the genetic engineering that you encounter is taking an extant genome and then tinkering with it to come up with something that is a variation on a theme. Creationists are fine with variations on the theme. It's the theme that counts. They are special creationists. They believe that God poofed into existence the various kinds of organisms. Now, they're perfect. I once had a scientist come up to me after a talk. As Richard pointed out, I've been doing this for a really, really long time. And this scientist came up, and he was going to solve my problem of creationism for me. He said, "Dr. Scott, all you need to do is tell them about pesticide resistance." Thank you. But actually, natural selection, pesticide resistance, antibiotic resistance, all of these classic examples of natural selection that we have are accepted perfectly fine by creationists. No problem. That exists. It's just because you start off with a bacterium, you end up with another kind of bacterium. You don't end up with a giraffe. Okay. What they're concerned about is getting something really different. Now, any kind of genetic engineering that we've seen thus far, like I say, is taking an extant genome and then tweaking it. There have been some efforts to try to build something from scratch, but really they all start with some basic plumbing that already started. So I think the creationists would say, doesn't count. You're still dealing with that, that specially created core of genetic information, and it's merely hubris to for you to think that you can do otherwise.
Thank you, Dr. Scott, for your lovely talk tonight. My question is regarding your mention of Answers in Genesis, that appalling website. So you said that they correctly state you should not use the argument that Darwin recanted evolution on his deathbed. Now, in your long career, trying to prove evolution, trying to prove reason to the other side, have you ever encountered any arguments or myths or statements that have been used to try to convince creationists that are not helpful, that you think might actually hurt reason?
No.
Thank you.
And I'll tell you why. Because what creation science and also really intelligent design specialize in, but particularly creation science, specializes in sifting through the scientific literature and finding some little anomaly that looks like it might disprove evolution or weaken the idea of radioisotopic dating or some other component of evolution. Upholding the anomaly and saying, see, we told you evolution didn't work. These are generally dealt with quite successfully. Really, all of the observation, all of the experimentation that we have demonstrates very clearly living things have descended with modification from common ancestors, and they form a branching tree of life that goes back to one or a few ancestors. Once you get to the very bottom of the tree of life, especially when you get the pre-eukaryote level, the nucleated varmints, things get really messy. So talking about the ancestor kind of misses the point. There's probably a universal common ancestor for eukaryotes, then you really got it. But that's where the data point. Evolution's real.
Thank you. I was going to ask a question about religion, but Richard will jump on me, so I'll ask a different question. You kind of put some of us university people on the spot. We're not doing a good enough job at explaining it, etc. It's difficult, and I think you maybe have underestimated that. I've taught third-year psychology undergraduates who are well-educated in a good education system. They say they accept evolution, of course, they say they understand it, but ask them to actually write down or stand up and say how natural selection works. And it all goes, blah, blah, blah. It is so unnatural in the way we seem to think to imagine adaptive design working by taking stuff away rather than putting it on. So partly I want you to forgive us because we do try, and partly ask a question, how can we really help? Because I've had experiences when I've explained something and got that aha, and they suddenly say, oh my God, of course. But how do we do that more often?
I wasn't making a point specifically about the teaching of any particular element of evolution. There are ways of teaching natural selection that are more likely to generate that aha moment, certainly. And you can find references on the web to people who have had success. I was talking about the more general idea that, the Theodosius Dobzhansky quote, nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. title of an article that he wrote many years ago. What that means is that the concept of common ancestry ties together everything in biology. But that is not what students come out of either college or high school, frankly, in my experience, understanding. And this is because there is the unit on evolution, which is plopped down at the beginning, the middle, or the end. It's plopped down someplace in the curriculum. And then it's treated like photosynthesis, and then you move on to the next topic. If you start, let's say as a professor, you start your class on introductory biology with the cell, which is kind of a boring way of doing it, but many people do that. Okay. How does evolution help us understand the cell? Well, of course, we've got lots of things. You can bring in Margulis, you can bring in all this neat stuff about the mitochondria showing characteristics of bacteria included. There's fun stuff you can do, making the point that common ancestry is what makes this thing make sense. Well, let's say that your next topic is molecular biology, okay? And you're comparing sequences across a variety of forms. Oh, look, when we do this, we find nested hierarchies. Why do you suppose we get nested hierarchies? It's because the more recently you shared a common ancestor, the more similar are your molecular sequences going to be. This is called evolution, boys and girls. Bring evolution into the class every single week. That doesn't mean that you're, yammering on about the role of natural selection, this, that, and the other thing. It's that you're bringing in the concept of common ancestry, because that is what is getting missed. That is what is not being communicated, at least in my country. And I was referring more to my experience. I will let you sort out your experience. But I think, Susan, I think you made my point for me, that it is really hard to do. And it takes a lot of thought, and college professors are busy people, but I do encourage you to think about it.
One of the leading books about natural selection in the wild is by the American biologist John Endler. And he tells a lovely story about how he was on a plane somewhere in the United States, and he got talking to his neighbor, and his neighbor asked him what he did, and he explained how he worked on guppies, and how he found that in streams where there were predators, the guppies all became drably colored, but in streams where there were not predators, the guppies all became, after some generations, brightly colored, because the females were choosing brightly colored. So he was obviously explaining to this man that natural selection. And this man said, gee, that's real interesting. There must be some theory behind that. And so Endler said, yes, it's called Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection. And the man turned away. He said, I don't believe in that. And he turned away and terminated the conversation.
And quite possibly he was a university-educated person, because most of the people you run into on airplanes are business people and so forth.
Yes.
Hello, Dr. Scott. I wanted to ask about, you know the fella who wrote the book about trees?
Oh, yeah.
And at the end of it, he went, oh yeah, and evolution, like that. Yeah. Well, I felt like he wasn't given enough credit. Like, I know he didn't write the book about it and make it exciting and popular, but like, it's pretty cool, isn't it? Like, just coming up with the idea. I feel like he deserved some credit, unless I've misunderstood.
No, certainly. The idea of natural selection was certainly in the air in the 1830s, 40s, 50s, etc. I gave you 3 examples, or 4, of people who kind of independently came up with it on their own. But like the historian of science that I quoted, the point that he made is that it's the person who really takes this and supports it. If you read the book on the origin of species, it is fascinating because it's just chapter after chapter after chapter of evidence for this idea of evolution through natural selection. I mean, he just supports it up the wazoo. None of these other guys did that. None of these other guys did that. Wallace to some degree, you know, I mean, he was a very good naturalist, but these others were kind of, oh, this is kind of an interesting
I think
thing.
that's right. I mean,
Yeah.
Wallace certainly had it, but Edward Blythe didn't have it at all. His idea of natural selection was simply stabilizing selection. His was almost an anti-evolution thing. It was stopping evolution happening. Patrick Matthew had it. He got it all right. There's your tree man. But I don't think he grasped its significance, because if he had, he wouldn't have published it in the appendix to a work on naval timber. And he wouldn't have complained about losing priority in a letter to the editor of the Gardener's Chronicle. Darwin and Wallace both grasped that this was not just an outgrowth of agriculture or forestry. This was the key to the whole of life. And Patrick Matthew, I don't think, got that.
Well said, well said.
I think I see Andrew hovering in the wings. I need to thank Eugenie very much for a wonderful lecture. Just one little story. I was once visited by a Japanese film crew, and they got an actor, an English actor, and dressed him up as Charles Darwin. He was dripping with grease paint and things falling off him all the way. And he came and knocked on my door, and I had to open the door and say, "Mr. Darwin, what an honor to..." And the idea was that we should sit down together and I should explain to him what had happened since his time.
Great.
And in particular, I explained to him Mendelian genetics, which, as you said, I mean, it wasn't only something he didn't know about, but it was the answer to a great riddle which puzzled Darwin and worried Darwin, actually, because it seemed to be a telling point against his theory. And the actor was quite good. He got up and he said, "Yes, that's it." I thought it was lovely. And as your lecture was, Eugenie, thank you very much for a wonderful lecture.